During the 1920s, times were not good for everyone. Most farmers saw their income drop, but for others like the economy, the Roaring Twenties was a period of impressive growth. This led to a lot of optimism that was very contagious. This optimism actually led to a lot of reckless activities. There was an explosive growth of American manufacturing, mostly in the automobile industry. By 1929, 1 in 5 Americans owned cars. This helped the industries related to automobiles, such as steel, oil, and rubber. These industries employ nearly 4 million workers. More workers were needed to keep up with production needs. Unemployment between 1923 and 1929 was very low, averaging around 3%. The low unemployment slowed the organized labor. Union memberships dropped as employers expanded to welfare capitalism programs. With the higher paychecks and the shorter working hours, people went to the movies, sports events, and other leisure activities. Times seemed good. Many Americans were really happy with how the economy was going, but the people who had invested in stocks were overjoyed. Stocks is an ownership in a company and it is sold in shares. When people buy shares, they are buying a piece of a corporation. If the corporation succeeds, its value may rise. This means the stock value also will rise. If the corporation doesn't do well, the value of the stock will go down. Although the stocks increase in different rates, the general trend in stock prices were sharply upward. Since the market never seemed to go down in the 1920s, many people began to act like it never would. While Americans celebrated their financial good fortune, a number of serious problems erupted beneath the surface. There was a vastly uneven distribution in the American economy from the new wealth being created. As a group, the wealthiest 1% of the population income had grown 60% between 1920 and 1929. Most workers, however, only received a much smaller pay increase and only 8% for most jobs. The workers in certain industries such as farming and coal mining were hit really hard. By 1929, more than 70% had an income below the level they needed for a good standard living. During the beginning of the decade, people were able to buy items such as automobiles, radios, vacuums, and more that were coming right off the assembly line. By the end of the decade, consumers were reaching a limit of their credit. Investors were not only buying consumer products on credit, they also were buying stocks with credit, which was called buying on margin. This meant that investors would pay off the loan once he or she sold the stock. The stockbrokers were loaning margins for the stock purchase and giving out bigger and bigger loans to investors. By 1929, the investors were able to buy a stock with as little as 10% margin. This was a gamble for investors. Brokers were able to force the investor to repay the loan if it fell below a certain point. This demand was called a margin call. The Federal Reserve System was very concerned about the nation buying stocks on margins and took action to make it more difficult to buy on margin. But despite their tries, it did not work. Many people never saw a crash in the stock market to ever happen, but some did. September 1929, economist Roger Babson sounded a warning note saying, "Sooner or later the crash is coming, and it may be terrific." Eventually, many people in the financial world began to sense trouble in the economy. Sales of manufacturing goods were sagging badly. Rumors spread that some big investors were ready to take their money out of the stock market. Fear began to grow. The stock prices were about to collapse.
On October 1929, the stock markets crashed. The crash led to an economic bust. The value of stocks dropped. Many people and businesses lost money. The economy got extremely worse. Stores could not sell their goods, so factories did not need as many workers. Businesses closed, and many people lost their jobs. Unemployment was high. This time of unemployment and hardship is called the Great Depression. It lasted through the 1930s. Many people, especially farmers, were in debt. They could not buy as many homes or consumer goods as before. Many banks closed, and customers lost their savings. Banks could not make loans to help businesses. This was a very depressing time for the people that were not wealthy. But even for the people that were wealthy, were on the shaky edge and becoming a possibility with the people that are not wealthy. The financial meltdown initiated by Wall Street's great crash of 1929 caused billions of dollars in assets to vanish into thin air. Wealthy Americans who owned almost all the nation's stocks at the time were walloped by an 80% decline in the value of the stock market. Even more troubling to the entire population were rampant bank failures between 1929 and 1933. 2 out of every 5 banks in America collapsed, causing more than $7 billion of their customers' hard-earned money to evaporate. Even after the initial crash, there was a wave of suicides in New York's financial area. The report said that the clerks of the hotel even started asking new guests if they needed a room for sleeping or jumping. During the Great Depression, the country was hit with an extremely large unemployment rate. By 1933, the unemployment rate had climbed from 3% to 25%. By 1932, over 13 million Americans had lost their jobs. The Great Depression caused hardship for Americans. In 1932, about 25% of the working population did not have jobs. People without jobs lost their homes because they could not pay their debts. Many became homeless and built shanties. The shanties were homes made from cardboard, broken cars, and wood scraps. There were shanty towns all across the United States. People also called these shanty towns Hoovervilles. After President Herbert Hoover, they blamed him for the economic problems. People were poor and hungry. They stood in bread lines at community kitchens to get free meals. Charity gave food to needy people. The Great Depression was very hard in the South. These farmers paid rent or a share of the crops they grew to the landowners. During the Depression, many of them had no money for rent, so they had to leave. In 1930s, there was a bad drought, the Great Plains. Also, no rain and soil, so the dirt turned into dust. People called this area the Dust Bowl. Many farmers left to find work. Artists such as Woody Guthrie expressed suffering during the Great Depression through photographs, music, and writing. On October 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. So the United States responded by borrowing over $1 billion to build up its military. As a result, U.S. manufacturing jumps by 50%. In 1939, the GDP had started to grow again, and the unemployment rate was falling. In 1939, the unemployment rate were at 17.2%. By 1942, the unemployment rate was under 5%. A combination of government spending promoted by the World War II and the expenses added to what ended the Great Depression. The Federal Reserve and the government can put conditions in place that are optimal for economic growth, but ultimately it was the people that drive the economic growth. Through innovation and growth in productivity, one can also conclude that this had some effect in ending the Great Depression. Innovation helps to increase demanding for goods, and growth in productivity helps to increase the outputting of goods. When the Great Depression was over, a lot of things changed. 10,000 banks that went out of business, then one half of the banks either closed or merged with other banks. The jobs that increased were the Federal Reserve. The government also were included. Then the Federal Reserve shifted to a policy of maintaining the high employment and fast growth. This was the start of showing that the Great Depression was over.